Hi, everyone. Please let me know if you can't hear at the back, just for audio purposes. My name is Mark Skinner. I'm the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Trent University. As we begin our event tonight, I want to respectfully acknowledge that we're on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. If you don't know, we're gathered here tonight in a building that's called Enwayang, which in Anishinaabemowin means the way we speak together, and I think that's a really great and poignant setting for an event like this that we're going to have. So on behalf of Trent University, it's my honor to welcome you to the Harry Kitchen Lecture in Public Policy. At Trent, we strive to be a strong and vibrant community partner. One of the ways we give back is by sharing knowledge, and it's really important that we do that with our community members. And the speaker series that you're going to hear tonight is made possible by philanthropy, and that's one of the most important ways that we have an excellent university, and it's how we become the most exceptional university. Tonight's lecture is thanks to the generosity of Professor Harry Kitchen. Harry is a distinguished economist who's written extensively on issues related to municipal economies and policies. Along with a 40-year career at Trent, starting in 1967, so if you're a Maple Leaf fan, you'll know what that means. Yes, I am a Maple Leaf fan, so I'm suffering with you. So a 4-decade career as a Trent professor, 1967 to 2007, so that's a legendary career, and we're very, very proud of Harry for that and his contributions. So in addition to that role for Trent University, Harry has served as a consultant and an advisor for governments and private sector institutions. Among his many honors, Harry was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for contributions to research on municipal finance and governance. So upon his retirement in 2007, Harry was named a Trent University Professor Emeritus, and his colleagues and friends recognized his contributions to both Trent and to the field of public policy by establishing this long-standing lecture series. The objective of the Harry Kitchen Lecture in Public Policy is to provide Trent University students and the wider community access to experts in the field of public policy. On behalf of Trent University and the Peterborough community, thank you, Harry, for your vision and dedication and for the legacy that you've left our university. And we're very fortunate, you can probably tell, that we have Harry with us here tonight, and I'd like to invite him to come up and introduce our distinguished speaker.
Well, I haven't been in a lecture hall now in close to 20 years, I suspect. Beware, I'm always used to 50-minute classes. I'll try to keep it a lot shorter introduction. I had a feeling the way Mark said that, and he told my longevity here, that he sounded as if he was surprised that I was still able to get up here, and maybe some of you were too. And sometimes I think that I feel that way. I would like to say that just a little bit on the background. This all started on December 31st, 2006. I was retiring the following June. And we got an invitation, my wife and I got an invitation to an old-timers hockey party on December 31st. I'd played with a group of guys, and we played a number of years, although I'd stopped playing well before. It turned out I went to the party. I was the only one who got that invitation. It happened to be a surprise retirement party. And Torben announced that time this lecture series. So there have been some very generous donors since then. And for that, I'm quite appreciative. Anyway, it's my honor here. I forgot my glasses. My son-in-law's loaned me his reading glasses, so bear with me here. In any case, I'll probably go off script a few times, so figure out where I'm going. It's certainly an honor to welcome and introduce tonight's guest speaker, Andrew Coyne. Andrew joins a growing list of distinguished public policy analysts who have previously spoken in this series. Amongst others, this list includes former federal deputy finance ministers, the parliamentary budget officer, the governor of the Bank of Canada, a list of distinguished academics, one of whom is with us today, Robin Baudouin, who's over here, a professor emeritus from Queen's, and he's been a strong supporter of us. In fact, I might make a note that Robin gave the third lecture in this series, and I believe it was in 2009, 2010, and I think the title was Canada's Future Fiscal Challenges. And it seems to me tonight Andrew Coyne's lecture may be a perfect follow-up to that. In fact, we'll find out if there's been anything different or anything expanded. It's certainly easy to cite Andrew's achievements, although I suspect this is unnecessary given the fact that the original room to host this event was sold out within about 4 days. I think we need to, for everybody here, they're going to be fully aware of what he's done. And a lot of the stuff that Andrew's done is cited on the program list. What I would like to do, I would, if I may, like to comment on a few things. For a number of us, and certainly for me, Thursday night around 10 o'clock is my time in front of CBC and watch the ad issue panel. And Andrew, who's a very prominent member of that issue panel, has commented on a number of political and economic issues that are, I think, particularly relevant, especially to the area of research I worked in. I spent most of my career, the last 3 decades, working on municipal finance and governance issues. A lot of stuff I wrote on was properly pricing for municipal services. There's a long history of municipal infrastructure and cities need more. My argument has always been until you start properly charging people for the services they use, we don't really know whether we have an infrastructure or not. We may simply have a problem in not charging the right prices when we do have the right thing. There are a couple of points that I would like to make that Andrew's written opinion pieces on in the last month and a half. In January, he wrote a piece on replacing the municipal property tax with a municipal sales tax. A really novel, and some might argue extreme, position. I'm not sure how far some of us go with that argument, but what I read from that was a push to say, look, cities and municipalities need more revenues, more revenue tools. All they have at the moment is a property tax, and it's about time they had something else. And I think what we need are more people pushing that theme, and I'm a particular proponent of that. The other topic he wrote on about a week and a half ago, and this was following an ad issues panel exchange about the week before, he wrote on the hullabaloo that's been created by the minister who's federal minister who stood up and said, no more money from the public government for roads. He's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. First of all, the federal government has very few roads. Roads are the provincial and local responsibility. But the problem with handing money over to roads suggests that the municipalities are currently charging the right price. And as Andrew very correctly pointed out about a week and a half ago, I believe it was in your opinion piece, that municipalities have to work at getting this, in essence, have to work at getting the right way of charging for the people who use the roads. You build more roads to ease congestion. Studies out of the US show the roads fill up, congestion comes back. So until you start properly pricing, you basically are not going to get the outcomes. I tell this because I remember back in 2015 or 16 writing a piece on proper pricing of municipal services, and I think it might have been infrastructure. And a few of my friends and relatives said, what are you working on? And I explained it to them. Their eyes glazed over. They nodded off. They said, oh, yeah, just let him go on. He'll stop eventually. And basically ignored it. And I remember one day picking up the Globe, and Jeffrey Stevens had written an opinion piece, and he picked up this theme. He referenced the fact I'd done this, and then he wrote it in layman terms and laid out the arguments, essentially what I'd said about proper pricing. All of a sudden, I had relatives call me, friends call me and say, we saw your name in the Globe today. You're really doing some good stuff. I said, that's what I told you I was doing before. Oh yeah, but you didn't explain it the way he explained it. So what I think is really important in this issue as an economist, that what you have to do, if you think, you have to get a journalist who's very, very well respected, and you have to get him on your side, and then you get lots of support. Look at the room here. If I talked about pricing municipal services, there might have been 2 of you showing up. My daughter who drove from Woodstock, she wouldn't want to leave me alone. In any case, without going on and on and on, I would really like to thank Andrew for taking this challenge and coming and speaking to us, and I'm certainly looking forward to the comments he will make.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Professor Kitchen, for that very kind introduction. I want to say what an honor it is to be asked to give this lecture, first as a non-economist. I like to say I'm not a practicing economist, but I speak economics. I have enough training to be able to if you speak slowly, I can sort of take it in and maybe translate it for people less versed in economics even than me. But secondly, it's a great honor to be asked to speak in honor of Harry Kitchen, one of the giants of Canadian economics. I'm just so pleased that to hear that he's reading my pieces is particularly gratifying and not throwing them across the room. So I've been asked to speak, or I guess I chose to speak, on what I'm going to call Canada's growth crisis. We in the media, of course, are in the habit of declaring absolutely everything to be a crisis, just because it's Tuesday. But I think, I hope to persuade you that we have a serious problem on our hands and maybe talk about some of the reasons we got into this mess and maybe some of the ways we can get out of it. Pardon me for a second. Canada's sluggish rate of economic growth has been a matter of concern for decades. In the 1950s and 1960s, growth in real output, that is, after adjusting for inflation, averaged in excess of 5% annually. By the 1970s, that had slowed to roughly 4%, to 3% in the 1980s, 2.4% in the 1990s, 2.1% in the 2000s, and in recent years, it has averaged just 1.5%. Slide 1, please. The picture looks even worse in per capita terms, where slow growth has given way to no growth. Slide, please. Indeed, with growth in real GDP now at or below the rate of growth in population, the country is facing the prospect of absolute declines in per capita output, not for a quarter or two as the result of some transitory economic shock, but for years on end. Real per capita GDP, assuming fourth quarter figures come in as expected, I think they're releasing them tomorrow, will have fallen in 5 of the last 6 quarters, leaving it no higher, by my calculations, no higher than it was in fourth quarter 2014. 9 lost years, maybe 10 with no end in sight. There has been no longer period of stagnation since the 1930s. Per capita, slide 3, please. Per capita GDP is as much or more of an issue as total output. The latter gives us a sense of the total amount of resources available to a country, which is important for the things a country does as a country. National defense, for example, where a country with a larger GDP can outspend its rivals. But most of the things that matter are better expressed in per capita terms. When we want to know about living standards, for example, we look at per capita income, not total income. Likewise, the quality of our social programs will be more closely related to how much we spend per capita than how much we spend overall. Both are ultimately determined by per capita GDP. GDP is not the only thing that counts, of course, as 1,000 critics will tell you. It is very limited in what it measures. Most of the complaints about it are perfectly valid, that it does not measure how clean the air is, or how equal or unequal incomes are, or how high or low the crime rate, and so on. It leaves out certain types of economic activity, like unpaid housework, and counts others as benefits, like fighting crime or cleaning up after natural disasters that are really costs. All true. But it is fairly good at measuring what it measures, output of goods and services in exchange. But yes, there's more to life than money or material things. Contrary to what you might have read, economists do not worship at the altar of GDP or even of growth in GDP. What an economist, I'll venture to speak for the economists here, will say is, tell me what your goals are as a society. Growth in GDP might be one, but so might be a lot of other things. I'll tell you how to achieve the optimal trade-off of those goals with the resources you have at your disposal, so far as they involve rival uses of those resources. And yet, as much as these social goals might be in conflict, as often as not, the one depends on the other. Yes, at the margin, there is a trade-off between, say, more material goods and a cleaner environment. But what's also true is that richer societies tend also to be greener ones, partly because they have the extra disposable income with which to pay for cleaning up their environment, and partly because the sorts of policies that make a society relatively wealthy, notably prices that accurately reflect the cost of scarce resources, including externalities, tend also to make it relatively clean. In this sense, the economic imperative and the ecological imperative are the same. Both are about minimizing waste. So growth may not be the only thing, but it is an important thing. When an economy ceases to grow, it isn't only living standards that suffer, so do the things that rising incomes buy, private and public, and as important, the things they represent. A society that cannot look forward to a future of rising living standards is one that is deprived of one of the primary motive forces of human behavior, hope. Without the universal lubricant of growth, moreover, all of the divisions within a society, between the classes, between the generations, between sexes and races, and this is Canada after all, the regions, are likely to be more inflamed. As the saying goes, when the watering hole runs dry, the animals start to look at each other differently. There's a particularly urgent need for growth in this country at this time. That is to say, with the aging of the population, the combination of the post-war baby boom working its way through the country's age distribution, the familiar pig in the python metaphor, coupled with longer lifespans. Put simply, we are entering a society unlike any that has ever existed. By 2050, that is, roughly 25% of the population will be over the age of 65, actually probably a fair bit sooner than that, 2043, I think, up from 19% today. Compare the early 1970s when the over 65s made up just 8% of the population. And within that 25% total, the proportions over the age of 75 and 85 and 95 and beyond will exceed previous records by even wider margins. The fastest growing cohort today are the centenarians. This has two primary implications. One, obviously, is cost, particularly for healthcare. As a rule of thumb, per capita consumption of healthcare doubles for each 10 years over the age of 55. Plus, you add in the cost of pensions, of elderly benefits, and so on. All told, the C.D. Howe Institute's Parisa Mabudi calculates population aging represents a net unfunded liability, promises to pay future beneficiaries of government programs beyond those for which revenues have been set aside, on the order of $3.9 trillion, with a T. That's on top of the unfunded liabilities in the Canada Pension Plan, another $1.2 trillion or so. I have no idea what the Quebec pension plans is, but probably a fifth of that on top of that, on top of the federal net debt of $1.2 trillion and the combined provincial debt of roughly $800 billion. All told, that's an implied public sector obligation in excess of $7 trillion, or nearly 2.5 times our annual GDP. Now factor in the second implication, relatively fewer people of working age. Not too long ago, there were as many as 5 workers for every retiree. Before long, that ratio will have fallen closer to 2.5 to 1, and I think ultimately it gets down to about 2 to 1. No doubt increasing numbers of people will elect to keep working past 65. I'm certainly planning on doing so, but not enough to make much of a dent in the basic arithmetic of population aging. Much higher costs with fewer people to pay for them. Neither will much else. Maybe we can reform healthcare, or maybe we can't. But even if we could, if we adopted every best practice, implemented healthcare economists' most radical proposals, grabbed every political third rail, the best that we can hope for is that we might slow the increase in healthcare costs as a share of GDP. Next slide, please. Healthcare is already absorbing almost 50% of provincial own source revenues, just for that one department. And the first wave of the baby boomers are still in their 70s. Similarly, we can take in more young people as immigrants. I'm wholesale in favor of that, but not enough to make much difference at any conceivable rate of intake, and of course, those young people will themselves eventually age, and you're just simply pushing the problem back. The implications of all this are particularly dire for the provinces. Every year, the Parliamentary Budget Officer issues a fiscal sustainability report, including long-run projections of each of the province's net debt-to-GDP ratios. The numbers tend to jump around from year to year, reflecting shifts in the baseline from which the numbers are projected and different assumptions, et cetera. However, I sort of put 4 years' worth together, and when you do that, certain trends emerge. And I think if we can see the next slide, 2 of the provinces, Manitoba and Newfoundland, are looking at debt-to-GDP ratios in 5 years' time in excess, oh, the slide didn't come up, that's too bad. All right, well, in excess of 70%. 2 more, Prince Edward Island and BC, are headed in that direction. For perspective, when Saskatchewan nearly hit the debt wall in the 1990s, its debt-to-GDP ratio was in the high 40s. But the federal government is hardly in the clear. True, its net debt-to-GDP ratio is currently only 42% or so, and true, it is a sovereign debtor with access in extremis to the printing presses, But it has its own long-run fiscal pressures, from underwriting the provinces to the expensive new social programs the current government has introduced, to the potentially massive costs of rebuilding the Canadian military for a dangerous new world. And that's assuming we're not hit by some kind of fiscal and economic shock, from a housing market meltdown to another oil price collapse to a major international war. It doesn't take much tweaking to show federal debt to GDP ratio rising north of 50%, on top of the provincial debts, on top of everything else. Well, there's only one way out of this, or to deal with this, and that is faster growth. You know, economists, politicians often say we can just grow our way out of it. For once, it's true in the long run. It doesn't have to be a lot faster, so long as it's sustained. That way we get the magic of compounding working in our favor. If we can get our growth rate up and keep it there year after year, decade after decade, the next generation or two will be so much richer than we are, they might be able to afford the crippling costs of looking after us in our dotage. This is, needless to say, not the kind of growth politicians typically talk about. Most of politics revolves around whether the economy is growing faster or slower, not over the long term, but right now. Something over which politicians have very little actual control, but for which they are eager to claim credit or cast blame, as the case may be. A matter of pulling a lever on a wall marked fiscal or monetary policy. The Trudeau Liberals, you'll recall, came to power promising stimulative deficits after the relatively slow growth of the Harper years, which they attributed to an excess of austerity. I'll just note here that the Harper government was responsible for 8 of the 10 largest spending years in our history to that point, measured in real dollars per person. The first Trudeau budget invoked multiplier effects of $3 or $4 for every dollar in spending. How far off those days seem today. I mean, we all know what happened then. Spending was ratcheted even higher. Tens of billions of dollars were added to the debt and produced growth even slower than under Harper. So what we're talking here today about is growth in the long term rather than the short. Growth as a secular rather than cyclical phenomenon. The problem with Canada's economy is not one of utilization, but capacity. It's not so much that growth is below potential as that potential growth itself is rather less than it might be. That's not, in other words, due to any temporary deficiency of demand, but of the economy's long-run ability to supply goods and services to meet the demand. Fixing that requires getting at the microeconomic foundations of the economy, how well or how poorly markets are functioning, rather than macroeconomic lever pulling. As it happens, this is the sort of growth that governments can do something about. For all the fruitless debates about stabilization policy and which form of stimulus is least ineffective at raising growth in the short term, the long-term growth trajectory of an economy really is responsive to policy. Certainly it is to bad policy. If you doubt it, consider the classic example of Canada versus Argentina. Can we get that slide up? Oh my goodness, the slides are not working. That's too bad. That's too bad. I'm not sure what happened there. I had them all lined up. Anyway, if you doubt it, consider the classic example of Canada versus Argentina, where Argentina had roughly the same per capita output as Canada at the beginning of the 20th century. By the end of the century, it was barely half as productive. And it is long-run growth rates that ultimately determine a country's standard of living. I'll ask for the slide again and see what happens. Yeah, it's not happening. That's too bad. Business cycle fluctuations that seemed terribly important at the time appear as mere blips on a long-run growth chart. Get the micro foundations right, and an economy can grow faster, for longer, and at lower levels of unemployment without overheating. So the need for faster growth has never been more clear or more urgent, and yet just when we need it most, growth has all but petered out. Historical comparisons only tell part of the story. After all, growth has slowed everywhere since the heyday of the 50s and 60s, particularly in the richer countries. But the slowdown has been especially pronounced in Canada. I think if you did a poll, you would still find large numbers of Canadians. I'm actually interested in if pollsters have asked this question or will. But I think you'd find large numbers of Canadians saying that we're still one of the richest countries in the world. At a guess, I think if you ask people, they'd probably say, oh, we're somewhere like 5th or maybe 7th. And 50 years ago, indeed, Canada ranked 8th among OECD countries in GDP per capita. As of 2022, we were 15th. And in the future, Canadians were jolted by a graph in the 2022 budget showing the OECD expects us to have the slowest growth in per capita GDP among its member countries over the next 40 years. Per capita GDP in Canada has now fallen to just 73% of US levels from 92% in 1981. Research by the economist Trevor Tombe has shown that Canada's richest province, Alberta, would rank 14th among US states. The poorest 5 provinces now rank among the 6 poorest jurisdictions in North America. Ontario ranks just ahead of Alabama. British Columbia is poorer than Kentucky. Where once we were well above the OECD average, we are on the verge of falling below it. We used to be richer than countries like Austria, Germany, Belgium, Finland, Iceland, and even Ireland. Now they are all richer than we are. And even this somewhat overstates our position. Canadians work more hours on average than people in other countries. Measured in output per hour worked, labor productivity in other words, we ranked 18th in 2022, and with the steady deterioration in our position since then, I don't think we should be surprised to find we dropped out of the top 20. Over the last 50 years since the OECD was founded, growth in labor productivity in Canada has been the slowest among the organization's charter members, tied only with Switzerland. This is not something we can just shrug off any longer. Canada could get by in recent decades with mediocre productivity growth because of 2 things: rapid growth in the labor force and high and rising commodity prices. But labor will not be so plentiful in future for the reasons stated, and the commodity price boom is not something we can bank on for the long term. So that leaves productivity, which not only has not improved, but if anything is getting worse. This abysmal performance, year after year, decade after decade, has been the cause of a great deal of scratching of heads among economists. It even has a name, the productivity puzzle. How could we be performing so poorly? We did everything right. For a while, in the 1990s and 2000s, that is, Canada seemed to be an example of everything that orthodox economics would recommend as recipes for prosperity. We signed a sweeping free trade deal with the United States and went on to sign dozens more with other countries. The Mulroney tax reform slashed top marginal rates of corporate and personal tax rates, with further cuts in corporate rates to follow. We brought inflation down to 2%, converted massive deficits into surpluses, the works. Still, growth rates declined. I think the safest thing to say is that these were necessary but not sufficient conditions. We may have got a lot of things right, but we've also still got a lot of things wrong. As Adam Smith famously said, there is a lot of ruin in a nation. We might have liberalized much of our international trade, for example, but important sectors of our economy, telecommunications, financial services, air travel, are organized to this day as protected oligopolies, theoretically open to competition, but effectively off limits thanks to restrictions on foreign investment. Others, the post office, rail travel, liquor boards, remain government monopolies in the 21st century for no reason other than it would be too hard to break them up. Prices may generally guide economic activity in this country, but in too many sectors, those price signals are clouded, either by overt subsidies to business, calculated by one recent estimate at $14 billion a year just at the federal level, or by preferences to corporations and individuals buried deep within the tax system. In every case, the effect is to persuade consumers and workers and investors to make decisions about allocating resources based not on the real costs and benefits to the economy of each choice, but on what subsidies, tax goodies, or regulatory preferences are attached. Most disgracefully of all, 157 years after Confederation, we still do not have a functioning common market, which was a large part of the point of the enterprise. Rather, commerce must fight its way through hundreds and hundreds of interprovincial trade barriers, notwithstanding repeated declarations that we've solved the problem. The combined impact of these, don't kid yourself, is considerable. A 2019 IMF study found the average internal trade barrier to have an effect on trade equal to that of a 21% tariff. All told, the study found liberalizing internal trade barriers would add nearly 4 percentage points to GDP. That's another $112 billion, or roughly $11,000 for a family of 4, every year forever. A study for the Senate committee looking into this found even higher potential gains from liberalization. Well, somewhere in all this, I venture to suggest, we may find the beginnings of an answer to our productivity puzzle. But first, what are the answers that have been tried to date by governments of various stripes? Answers whose popularity seems undimmed by what seems to be their transparent failure. At the least credible level, there are the constellation of policies that might be grouped under the rubric of industrial strategy or industrial policy. Subsidies to business and sectors thought to be particularly strategic, the cultivation of national champions to be protected from foreign takeovers, and so on. These are in turn rooted in a number of untested and perhaps unconscious assumptions that governments are better placed to divine our industrial future than private investors whose livelihoods depend on it, that there are particular sectors that are more befitting of an advanced industrial economy than others, manufacturing rather than resource extraction, high technology rather than low, goods rather than services, based not on economic criteria, but on what the former OECD chief economist David Henderson has memorably called the techno-aesthetic intuition of the speaker. In particular, the notion that higher value-added industries are to be preferred, as in that quote you often hear of, we've got to move up the value-added chain. You hear a lot of this sort of thing. Rather than pipe crude oil south for refining in other countries, we should be refining it here at home. We ship them bitumen, they ship us saran wrap. Or we ship them coal, they ship us steel. Or we ship them raw logs, they ship us dining room sets. It clearly greatly offends a certain sensibility. But at best, it betrays a basic confusion of concepts, what might be called the value-added fallacy. What companies want are higher profits. What workers want are higher wages. What both should want is higher productivity. It's productivity that ultimately determines wages and living standards, not where you happen to be in the value-added chain, which, after all, offers the better return. Selling crude widgets or whatever for $6 that cost you $2 to produce, or moving up the value-added chain and selling refined widgets for $8 that cost you $6. It isn't that governments can't pick winners, though it should be said, as it often is, that even if governments can't pick winners, losers can pick governments. It's that the whole enterprise is fundamentally misconceived. At best, it's a zero-sum game. Whatever jobs and output are created in the subsidized sector are simply the jobs and output that are diverted from other sectors, the ones that can compete without subsidy. There's no way around this. If a project is economic, if it provides more benefit to society in terms of what consumers are willing to pay for at the margin versus the costs of the resources it used in production. If a project is economic, it doesn't need a subsidy. If it isn't economic, it doesn't deserve it. At this, the industrial policy advocate is inclined to smile indulgently. That's all right in theory, he will say, but let's be practical. In the real world, and here he will let you in on a little secret, other countries subsidize their industries. I never knew. We can't afford to be the Boy Scouts of the world. If we want to be in the auto business, or whatever other industry is under discussion, we've got to be there with it. We've got to match their subsidies with our subsidies. But notice the assumption that gets slipped in there. If we want to be in the auto industry, well, first of all, who's we? And secondly, do we? Why is it a given that we must be in any particular industry? Why is that just taken for granted? Does God say so? Is the practical reality person really saying that he has absolute a priori foreknowledge of what industries we have to be in as a country? To see what's wrong with this, consider an argument for subsidy that actually makes some sense. It's known in the literature as strategic trade theory. Suppose first there were a product with massive economies of scale, of a kind that required a global market to realize. And suppose, second, it were possible to identify this product with certainty in advance. Not only that it could realize these sorts of economies of scale in theories, but that in fact these would in fact be realized. And suppose the government were to use this intelligence to give Canadian producers a head start, a first mover advantage, by subsidizing their production costs, I should say. And suppose, crucially, that no other country thought to do the same. well, then it is true. Our producers, exploiting the cost advantage the subsidy granted them, would jump out to an early sales lead over their competitors, their advantage widening as those economies of scale kicked in, enabling them to add more sales and cut costs even further until eventually they acquired a worldwide monopoly in the product in question. So if you buy all of these assumptions and all of these supposes, then yes, the profits from such a monopoly would be so enormous as to outweigh any conceivable opportunity cost. The zero-sum game of most industrial subsidies would become a positive-sum game. But here's the thing, if any of those assumptions do not hold, if the product does not possess such economies of scale, if we're unable to identify them in advance, or if other countries with deeper pockets than our own subsidize their own producers, then the whole theoretical construct collapses. It's just another subsidy and fails for the same reason that other subsidies do. The assumptions needed to make strategic trade theory work, in short, make the case for why it's unlikely ever to apply. In the real world that industrial policy advocates are so fond of invoking, the willingness of other countries to subsidize their industries makes the case against us doing the same rather than for it. The only thing we win from subsidy in such circumstances is the right to go on subsidizing. The only game it keeps our guys in is a losing game. Now, the current government professes, against all evidence, to abjure picking winners. I mean, it's made some pretty big bets that sure look like they're thinking they're picking winners, but they say no, it's what they're really doing is not betting on particular companies, but on particular technologies. But the principle is the same. No one knows what the technologies of the future are. Nobody. Everyone's guessing. The only thing that can be said with any confidence is that most of the technologies of the future are still in the future. Much of the jobs and growth in the years and decades to come will be in industries that do not exist yet, indeed that haven't even been dreamt of, just as much of the present-day economy is made up of industries and technologies that did not exist 20 years ago. Who predicted the iPhone would conquer the world 20, 25 years ago? Who thought AI would have come as far as it has as soon as it has? People in the industry were talking about 25, 30 years from now, 2 years ago. And look where we are, and changing rapidly by the day. Well, more credible, though scarcely more successful, are the suite of policies the government presents in the name of modern supply-side economics. The basic underlying rationale that policy should aim to improve economic capacity generally rather than dictate particular outcomes is sound enough. And the policies, more spending on infrastructure, more spending on education and skills, more spending on research and development. I'm sorry, I'll start that again. I said spending. I meant to say more investment in infrastructure, more investment in education and skills, more investment in research and development, or more broadly innovation. Well, they certainly sound sensible. It's when you get into the details that you realize how ill thought out it really is. In particular, what you find is an obsession with broad aggregates. How much infrastructure spending? How much education are people getting? How much R&D spending? With the quantity that is rather than the quality. And you find very little clear thinking about the role of government and why and where government needs to get involved. Possibly these two phenomena are connected. It turns out it matters not just how much money is being spent, but by whom and in what circumstances. If decisions on infrastructure spending or education or innovation are being made not in a decentralized way that is responsive to costs and benefits by people risking their own money, but by politicians in a bunker somewhere, chances are the bang for the buck will be suboptimal. Let's take infrastructure. You remember in those early years, the Liberals were running deficits, and they kind of hedged and fudged on whether this was old-fashioned Keynesian pump priming stimulus on the demand side, or whether it was, they were investing in infrastructure projects that would raise national productivity and increase economic output in the long run. And they basically wound up saying both at the same time. Basically, the only thing that connected them was that the liberal approach in both cases was the same, spend a lot of money now. But as they said, with interest rates at historic lows, remember that? Now was the time to borrow and invest. How can you count the cost at a time like this? And it wasn't a completely unreasonable argument in principle. Except, first of all, comparatively little of the $15 billion increase in annual spending the Liberals pledged in their election platform in 2015 was even nominally for infrastructure. And then when you drilled into the stuff that they did call infrastructure, 2/3 of it was for social and environmental spending, which is a little bit of an iffy stretch of the term infrastructure. But even the stuff that was hardcore infrastructure doesn't necessarily offer the sort of productivity payoffs that they were claiming it. Just because you call it infrastructure or just because it is infrastructure doesn't mean it necessarily pays off in higher productivity. It depends. Infrastructure for what? For whom? On what costs, what costs and what benefits? If only there were some sort of market test of the return on investment in infrastructure, some way of gauging whether the benefits exceeded the costs. Well, there is. If the projects are to be financed by user fees, for example. If consumers are willing to pay the fees, and if the fees are enough to cover the cost of the project, that would suggest the project was worth pursuing. It's a test not just of costs and benefits, but of whether there's actual demand for the service. You'll recall that was the theory behind the Canada Infrastructure Bank before its independence was compromised basically in its cradle. But the minute you do attach such a measurable return, the case for borrowing on the public tab arguably disappears. Private investors could be enticed to supply the necessary funds in return for the flow of revenues. Public goods, as we know, are things where you can't charge a price for the consumers. You can't exclude people from consumption if they don't pay. You can't reserve the benefits to those who do. But if people can and do pay the price for it, then that falls to the ground. And if you can finance something privately, you probably should. Tax dollars are scarce like anything else. Logically, they should be reserved for things that can only be financed through taxes. When you pay for things with taxes that could be paid for in other ways, you are shortchanging the things that can only be paid for with taxes, the genuine public goods. So yes, historically low interest rates were an argument that somebody should be borrowing and investing in these projects. It just didn't necessarily follow that it should be the government. Much the same applies to the education and skill development agenda. There's little doubt that other things being equal, more education, more human capital will make for more productive workers. But are other things equal? Canada has the most highly educated population in the OECD, with 54% of its adult population, according to the 2016 census, having graduated from post-secondary education. We spend among the most of our GDP on higher education of any country in the OECD, behind only Chile and the United States. But where's the evidence that it's actually paying off in terms of higher productivity? It's all very well to wave your hand and talk about it, but the results are leave something to be desired. Or take the innovation agenda. Now, it's well established in economic principle that basic research, the kind of blue sky research with no immediate commercial application, is the sort of thing that governments need to fund. You can't rely on markets because there's no incentive for a private firm to spend money on research that does not pay off in new products with the benefits that accrue to that company, but can be siphoned off by its competitors. But by the same token, government should not be in the business of funding applied research, that is, research directed to commercial uses. Not only is this unnecessary, business can perfectly well fund this sort of thing on its own, but it inevitably tilts the pitch in favor of certain activities over others, some technologies, products, and firms, etc., at the expense of the rest. Nevertheless, governments of all stripes feel it's their duty to spend heavily on both basic research and applied research. After all, more research equals more innovation equals higher productivity equals more growth, right? This fervor has only grown the less the results anyone has to show for it. When the Harper government reviewed federal R&D programs in 2011, I apologize, I don't have more up-to-date research on this, but I don't imagine the situation has changed greatly. They found support totaled $5 billion every year, it'll be much more than that today, delivered through more than 60 programs spread across 17 different agencies. The Industrial Research Assistance Program, the Idea to Innovation Program, the Technology Demonstration Program, the Strategic Aerospace and Defense Initiative, the Automotive Innovation Fund, the Strategic Network Grants, the Centers of Excellence for Commercialization and Research, the Networks of Centers of Excellence, the Business-Led Networks of Centers of Excellence, the Centers for Strategic Research and Innovative Technology Networks. Okay, I made that one up. But you get the picture. And that's just at the federal level. There are hundreds more innovation programs at the provincial level, and who knows how many others lurking among the nation's municipalities and, I dare say, universities. To innovate in the agricultural sector in Ontario alone requires the help of no fewer than 45 such programs, courtesy of 7 federal and provincial departments, all on top of the flagship federal tax incentive, the venerable Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit, which seems to be unkillable. There's another review going on, but we'll see whether it ever meets its maker. Altogether, Canada is reckoned to provide among the most generous systems of R&D support in the world. Is there a pattern emerging here? And the result of all these hundreds of billions of dollars of support and support for innovation, this Manhattan Project of industrial research? Well, you tell me. Not only have all these programs not helped the cause, they seem actively to be retarding it. The Liberals only added to these. A short list of Liberal innovation programs would include the Canada Infrastructure Bank, I mentioned before, essentially moribund. The Superclusters program, nobody talks much about that before, but it was designed to create world-beating highs of activity in selected sectors and cities across Canada. Innovative Solutions Canada, a program to boost startups through government procurement. The Strategic Innovation Fund, the various government-sponsored venture capital funds administered by the Business Development Bank, all the way to the Canada Growth Fund, the Canada Innovation Corporation. Oh, and did I mention $50 billion in subsidies for battery manufacturers in more recent budgets? And what do we have to show for it? Falling capital stock, falling productivity, falling relative living standards year after year after year. Perhaps we need a shift in approach. What we've been doing hasn't been working terribly well. What should we do instead? We can start by grasping the seriousness of the situation. As I hope I've convinced you, we do not have a growth problem, we have a growth crisis. At the very moment our fiscal and economic pressures are mounting, growth is collapsing. And if we understand how serious the situation is, it follows we should be committed to do what is necessary to turn things around, within reason. Incrementalism is not going to cut it, I'm afraid. It's time to think in much more radical terms. Well, what would a serious pro-growth agenda look like? Let's go back to our basic solo swan growth model. Growth in output is the sum of changes in labor plus capital plus technological change. Well, you say, we've got plenty of labor. And it's true. Employment in Canada is at or near all-time highs, not only in absolute terms, but as a proportion of the working age population. But if you look at employment as a proportion of the whole population, the picture changes a bit. So if you look at the, I had slides for this, but the 15 to 64, it's an upward curve with a spike during the pandemic, but basically an upward curve. If you look at proportion of the whole population, in other words, including the over 65s, it's flatline. And most likely is going to go down in years to come. So certainly anything that can be done to increase labor supply is to my liking to the good. Not only sustained high immigration, I know it's got a bad name these days, but I'll defend it, but generally mobilizing every spare person hour of labor. But the more immediate problem is on the capital side. Simply put, investment in Canada has fallen to levels that can only be described as anemic. The alarming deterioration in our productivity performance closely tracks the extraordinary relative decline of business investment in Canada. The OECD tracks investment, gross fixed capital formation, across its 38 member states plus 9 others. From 2011 to 2015, Canada's performance was merely awful, 37th out of 47. From 2015 to 2023, it was appalling, 44th. If, therefore, per capita growth has been similarly lagging, it has much more to do, in my submission, with a shortage of capital than a surplus of labor. Our workers are less productive than other countries' workers because they have less capital to work with. As recently as a decade ago, gross fixed capital formation per worker in Canada was within striking distance of the United States, about 95%. It has since declined to 68%, roughly 2/3. As of 2022, each Canadian worker had on average about $19,000 to work with in constant 2015 US dollars versus almost $29,000 for every American worker. A similar decline has been observed relative to the OECD generally. As of 2022, we stood 15th in the OECD. In 2013, just a decade ago, we were 8th. So slow is the rate of new investment each year that it's not even enough to replace existing capital as it wears out or grows obsolete. A recent study for the C.D. Howe Institute notes the real stock of capital per worker has been on a downward trend since 2015, a deterioration unlike anything since these measures began. When people blame rapid population growth then for the decline in per capita GDP, I have to beg to differ. The problem isn't that our population is growing at 1.5% or 2% per annum. The problem is that our economy won't grow any faster than that. Or to put it another way, the problem is not too many problems. The problem is not too many people. The problem is too little capital. Productivity was an issue long before the recent population boom began. And in any case, there's no reason per capita output must necessarily be a simple arithmetic function of population growth. Yes, other things being equal, more workers equals less capital per worker equals lower productivity, but other things are not necessarily equal. The willingness to save and invest is not set in stone. It responds, among other things, to changes in policy. So the first priority, it seems to me, is to raise investment levels. That may seem obvious, but it does not seem to have been at all obvious to those in power, who have only recently discovered that we have a productivity problem. For all the attention paid to raising human capital, none at all seems to have been paid to the old-fashioned kind, physical capital. Indeed, the situation is, again, worse than I've let on. When you disaggregate gross fixed capital formation into its component parts, so first you separate out private versus public investment, and then you separate out the different kinds of investment, different targets, you find a striking trend. And this, here I really wish I had the chart. Since around 2000, while investment in residential structures has roughly doubled as a percentage of GDP, investment in machinery and equipment has roughly halved. So before 2000, they're running along at more or less the same rate as a percentage of GDP. And after 2000, investment in residential structures goes up. Investment in machinery and equipment, the kind of thing that raises productivity, has gone down. Now, it's hard to square that, at first blush, that increased percentage going to residential structures when we've been told and we've heard about the shortage of housing stock. I suspect that's because so much of that investment has been in single-family structures where you can earn a higher return rather than in multifamily dwellings or apartment blocks. I think that's what explains that seeming anomaly. Well, how do we raise investment? I don't want to make things too complicated, by reducing the barriers to investment. These are two in the main, and first, I'm sorry if this is maybe a little predictable, but high rates of taxation on capital income remain an important barrier. Yes, Canada's rates are not as high as they were, say, 50 years ago, but they remain higher than in many comparable countries, not only on corporate taxes, where in recent years we've given up the competitive advantage that we had once managed to eke out, but especially on personal income tax, where the top marginal rate has not only not been cut since the 1980s, but has actually increased, so much so that our top rates are now among the highest in the developed world. Perhaps the moment has arrived, 30-odd years after the last major tax reform, to think bigger. At the very least, we could broaden the tax base, eliminating many of the hundreds of special tax preferences and exemptions known as tax expenditures that litter the tax code, and applying the revenues to cutting rates. More radically, we could adopt the recommendation of many economists and abolish the corporate income tax together. Corporations, after all, do not ultimately pay the tax, but pass it on, some to shareholders in lower returns, some to consumers in higher prices, but most of it, as recent research suggests, to their employees in lower pay. If so, it would not only be more efficient, but more fair to tax corporate earnings at the personal level after they're distributed to individuals. The corporations could be taxed not on income, but on cash flow, or as Professor Bodway has argued, on an economic rents basis, where the stimulative effect of allowing a business to fully deduct an investment up front rather than over the life of the investment would likely dwarf that of cutting a few points off of corporate income tax rates. And if I could just improvise just for one moment here, if there's one reform we could really make, it is to abolish the preference for small businesses. I don't want to annoy any small business people here, but we have too many small businesses in this country. I don't want to eliminate small businesses, but I don't want to favor them in the tax code, since all the research shows that small businesses have lower rates of productivity, lower growth prospects, et cetera. And what we're doing in the tax code is basically encouraging businesses to stay small. And we have, I think we have something like 1.4 million businesses in this country, 98% of them are micro businesses, the vast majority of which have no intention of growing at all. God save them. If that's a lifestyle choice, fine. But we should not be preferencing it as heavily as we do in tax policy, and that may well be one of the things that is slowing our productivity growth. And the other barrier to capital formation, foreign investment controls. We will not be able to sustain the kind of high rates of investment we'll need in the future just in our domestic savings, not with a household savings rate of just 5%. We need to supplement with the savings of foreigners, and we need to be open to foreign investment if we're going to take full advantage of that. We may think of ourselves as being relatively open to foreign investment. The OECD, which studies these things, begs to differ. So in particular, I think we should take seriously one of the recommendations of the late lamented Competition Policy Review Panel, chaired by the former BCE chairman Red Wilson, and reverse the onus in the current opaque net benefit test on foreign takeovers. Rather than require those in favor to prove it is of net benefit to Canada, require those opposed to show it is of net disbenefit. But as with anything else, it's not just the quantity of investment that matters, it's the quality. How can we be sure that new capital is being put to its highest and best use, the kind that increases productivity? Tax reform is part of that. Eliminating distortionary tax preferences is as important as lowering marginal tax rates, maybe even more important. But so is eliminating business subsidies on the same principle. People make better decisions about how to use scarce resources when they know what things cost. When they don't, they make dumb decisions. When the costs are hidden from them, they make dumber decisions. So we need not just sweeping tax reform, but sweeping subsidy reform, a comprehensive program of desubsidization. It makes no earthly sense, for example, that in the name of regional development, we subsidize every part of the country, in effect attempting to redistribute from everybody to everybody. It's just arithmetically impossible. But it's no smarter to be subsidizing every industry and every corporation within each industry, as we are perilously close to doing. And I invite you, if you doubt this, to read through, as I have done, in the public accounts every year, they list in 6-point agate type. I don't claim that I've read every line of it, but the sheer volume of it will impress you. In 6-point agate type, they list just the subsidies over $100,000. And it goes on for a couple of hundred pages. And you, after scrolling through it, you come away with the belief that every corporation, trade association, religious group, community association in the country is somehow got its hooks into, again, just the federal government. How much better off would we all be if, rather than taxing everybody at punitive rates in order to subsidize everybody, we stopped the merry-go-round altogether and cut them both? But even with accurate prices and lower taxes, people still won't necessarily take the risks and disruption that go with any attempt to meaningfully improve productivity unless they have to, unless they're in fear that their competition will eat their lunch if they don't. So the third part of this approach favors maximizing the free play of competition in the economy without attempts to protect one sector or another. You want an innovation policy? Competition is the most effective innovation policy. There's a tendency in political circles to treat innovation as if it were a kind of piece of industrial machinery in itself. You inject a certain amount of government funding for R&D at one end, and out pops higher productivity at the other. It isn't so. You can find a correlation just between Canada's heroic levels of tax assistance for R&D and actual spending on R&D, but there's very little connection between aggregate spending in R&D and innovation, and still less with higher output. We have to get away from this fascination with aggregates. We begin to be on firmer ground if we understand innovation as less as a scientific process and more as an economic one. As the Council of Canadian Academies put it in its report, Innovation and Business Strategy, Why Canada Falls Short, innovation is best defined as new or better ways of doing valued things. The real gains in productivity do not typically come from startling technological breakthroughs or gee-whiz inventions, but from thousands and thousands of incremental gains at every stage of production in businesses large and small across the country. Often these amount to nothing more than adopting existing technologies or best practices already in place elsewhere. And what drives companies to do that? Competition. Competition, competition, competition. What comes out in all of the literature on productivity is the critical importance of competitive intensity in creating the incentive for businesses to innovate. Companies innovate not because they can, but because they must, because the fear that the other guy will eat their lunch if they do. It's when managers lie awake at night thinking of all those little things, that what can I do tomorrow on the shop floor to make things run smoother, that much innovation occurs. As the Council of Canadian Academies noted, competition is among the most potent incentives for innovation, both because of the benefits innovation can provide and the threats that can be averted if innovation keeps a firm running ahead of its competitors. And yet, competition is everywhere constrained in Canada. Not everywhere, but it is far too prevalent. Lack of competition is a pervasive problem in Canada, not as an accident of history, but as a matter of deliberate policy. Why is our healthcare so expensive yet produces such mediocre results? Because no one in the system knows what anything costs, certainly, but more because no one has any incentive to find out what anything costs. The hospital administrator does not need to know whether her hospital is charging more or less than its competitors for a tracheotomy. It has no competitors. Why do Canadians pay 2 and 3 times the market price for such staple food items as milk, eggs, butter, and poultry? Because their producers have been organized into government-sponsored price-fixing rings, backed by production quotas and protected by 3-figure tariffs, the whole racket dignified by the euphemistic name of supply management. Why is postal service so glacial and yet so costly? Because Canada Post, unlike postal services across Europe, remains a statutory monopoly. Why is Via Rail so slug-like and unpleasant? Because it too remains a monopoly. Competition in rail is perfectly possible. The rails may be a natural monopoly, but not the cars that run on them. Only policy forbids it. Maybe we could afford to put up with this nonsense in the past. We can't anymore. So let's get serious. Let's start to dismantle these ancient monopolies. And while we're at it, let's crack open those cozy little oligopolies I mentioned in telecommunications, financial services, and domestic air travel. We know that competition, real competition, we've just seen the collapse of Lynx Air, the latest in a long string of domestic startups to collapse. We know that real competition in air travel, for example, has to come from allowing foreigners to compete in our airspace. And yet we have these obscure laws restricting, or forbidding, in fact, foreign airlines from flying point to point within Canada. We even give it a strange and esoteric name. We call it cabotage, as if it was this weird, unearthly practice that would never be practiced in a civilized country. We can't afford that kind of nonsense anymore. You'd think in a country as vast as Canada, we would want to make travel and communications as cheap and efficient as humanly possible. The point, after all, of putting planes in the air is not to give pilots something to do. It's to move passengers from one place to another. And yet the operating principle of Canadian regulatory policy is the opposite. Industries are not regulated in the interests of the people who use them, consumers, but in the interests of the industries themselves. That's not only a matter for consumers, it has broader implications for productivity and innovation, and for wages, which depend on both. In a market economy, it is consumers who, by choosing among the offerings of competing firms, drive each to look constantly for ways to lower costs. Muzzle competition, and you not only despoil consumers, but you constrain the relentless search for new and better ways of doing valued things that alone fuels gains in productivity. It strikes me that all of the measures that might be introduced to bring more competition to the Canadian economy can be summed up in 2 words: consumers first. If governments understood nothing more than that consumption is, as Adam Smith put it, the sole end and purpose of all production, and that therefore, quote, the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. And if every regulation were therefore subjected to the test of whether it served the consumer interest, whether it put consumers first, the country, I submit, would be a lot more prosperous and consumers a lot less angry. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Do we have any questions from the audience? And we have a mic coming around. Anybody have questions?
I will answer any questions on any topic with the proviso that the answer may be I don't know. And particularly, I I ask you this courteously, but please don't ask me to predict anything. I like to tell people I am not in the predictions business. I am in the finger-pointing, backbiting, and recrimination business. And I stick to my knitting. Anyway, please go ahead.
You mentioned, right here.
Oh, yes.
You mentioned that we have to limit tax benefits for small businesses. What do you mean by that? And how do we balance that so that we don't just like completely get rid of all these small businesses?
Well, since I'm not running for election, I will tell you frankly, we need to have fewer small businesses in the country. That we have so many is in part a product of policy, and the policy is holding us back. So the biggest one is, I think it's the biggest anyway, is the special lower tax rate for small businesses, which is, as I say, a disincentive to get larger, and it's also creates incentive for businesses to do all kinds of little tricks to make themselves look smaller and to get below a certain threshold. And I don't have it top of mind, but there are a bunch of other preferences for small businesses, not to say as well as overt subsidies. So my overarching point is, as with anything else, we want the private interest and the social interest to align. We want people to start small businesses because the profits that they're seeking will be genuine profits that don't depend upon tax goodies, that will add to the sum total of welfare in the country. So when people are making choices on the basis of real costs and benefits and not because it's been distorted by tax preferences, then fine, have at it with starting your own business, but don't do so essentially implicitly or explicitly on the public dime, not because there's anything immoral about that, but just because it's not good policy. We should not be under the illusion that every small business, or even a tiny fraction of them, is some dynamic go-getter that's the industry of the future. I'm all for entrepreneurship, and there's no doubt that from mighty oaks, from tiny acorns grow. But let actual costs and benefits govern that decision rather than I'll be sheltered from the winds of economic misfortune by tax preferences and subsidies.
Hello.
Yeah, the green.
Hello?
Hello.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Like Dr. Kitchen, I always look forward to your panel on Thursday night as well. My question is specifically to potentially climate tech, where I think is interesting part of the Canadian economy. The Boston Consulting Group, they have a center called the Center for Canada's Future. They released a report recently, it was just late last year, basically saying that 83% of Canadian investment in clean tech goes outside of Canada. Right. So when you just rightly said that we need to attract more foreign investment, what do we do about domestic investment that goes abroad that really is, I think, also exacerbates that problem? The second thing is that report also said that part of the reason why we see this is a kind of pervasive conservatism in corporate Canada that leads to kind of resistance to taking on ambitious ideas in maybe unproven industries, as well as an ambition gap between Canadian and American entrepreneurs that also leads to that kind of fund migration south. So which I kind of see as more of a cultural issue than necessarily a public policy issue, maybe not, but because that kind of wording of conservatism in corporate Canada led me to think that there's maybe a cultural component to this than just a matter of public policy. I would like to hear your thoughts if possible. Thanks.
Cultural arguments are always fraught. People are forever declaring, well, this or that country did a certain thing because of its culture, and then you dig into it and you find, well, no, there was actually policies that accounted for that. So the country didn't used to be terribly entrepreneurial, and then there's policy change and it becomes quite entrepreneurial, for example. Now, you can argue that both ways. Why was the policy changed? Maybe there were cultural things that underpin. It's just complicated, it seems to me, that what's downstream of what in that regard. I do think some of the cultural things that we have historically attributed to Canada changed a lot after free trade, for example. A lot of the things that we thought of as just being natural things of, well, we just hide within our own borders, et cetera, changed a lot after that. Not as much as perhaps we'd like. We had an initial surge in exports and imports as a percentage of GDP, and it's come back a bit in the last few years. But I think, having lived through that, I think that had a profound cultural shift. That policy change made a profound policy shift. I remember the debates before free trade when people would look at you like you had two heads if you said, I think we should get rid of all of our tariffs and protective barriers from the United States. It was like, how would a fish live out of the water? Like we would just be naked and defenseless and we'd be overwhelmed. And I don't think people think that way anymore. So that's, I think, a positive cultural change. You know, on the clean tech stuff, I really wish that the government had the courage of its own convictions on this. It has presented itself as the party and the government of carbon pricing. And every economist in this room, I think, would agree that carbon pricing is by far the most efficient way of encouraging people to reduce their carbon emissions. And it is for a number of reasons, one of which is versus, you know, the alternatives of regulation and subsidy. Subsidies only have effect on the things that it encourages the planner to subsidize, just as with regulations. Subsidies oftentimes pay people to do things they were going to do anyway. And of course, the other thing about subsidies is even if you're subsidizing people to do something less wasteful than the other thing, you're still subsidizing waste at some point. And so it's inferior to simply internalizing the externality. Just charge the carbon tax and you have covered the cost. You've made the incentive, all the incentive you need for behavioral adjustment. These subsidies and regulatory schemes are not only, you know, vastly costlier when you do the cost analysis of them, but they get you into these anomalies where you're subsidizing people to do things where they then suddenly run off and take the benefit of it and go off to another country. You can't do that with a carbon tax. So when you actually look at, as I have, the accounting of this, of how much of current and projected emissions reductions are accounted for through carbon pricing, I make it to be about 1/3. So the party that's in favor of carbon pricing is only using it for 1/3 of emissions reductions. And the conservatives, of course, are promising to scrap it altogether, or at least at the consumer level. And why I think this is really important, coming back to the topic of the thing here, is, you know, let's put it this way. The Eco-Fiscal Commission, which was a group of economists that looked at the economics of environmental policy, they did some number crunching on comparing two scenarios. One is having a carbon price versus doing nothing, assuming doing nothing was an option. So that was one comparison. The other comparison was carbon pricing versus regulatory and subsidy schemes. And I'm not going to have the numbers exactly right, but it's something on this order, that the additional costs of carbon pricing versus doing nothing were something like 5/100ths of 1% off of GDP. Something very small, in other words. The additional costs of subsidies and regulatory schemes versus carbon pricing was like 16 times that. It was 0.8 of a percentage point per year. Now, if we were growing at 5% per year, then maybe you'd say, okay, politics is what it is. Carbon pricing is hard to sell. Let's just do regulatory and subsidy scheme. And all we'll do is we'll take GDP growth down from 5 to 4%, let's say. And maybe that's worth doing. But if growth is only going to be, absent these measures, is only going to be like 1.6% per year, then if you're doing measures that cost you 0.8 of a percentage point, you're basically cutting your growth rate in half. So this is craziness. We can't afford this kind of craziness in our environmental policy. It is an imperative, given all the other costs that we're dealing with, that we do climate change policy, carbon emissions reduction policy, in the cheapest possible way, because we can't afford to do anything else. And yet, where are we headed? We're doing it in some ways, some of the most expensive ways. You know, subsidies for EV vehicles is just, it's absurd when you do the number crunching on the cost per ton of emissions reduced. So I hope I sort of answered your question on that.
There's a question from the online audience.
Oh, cool.
Andrew is a first-year PhD student at Trent who is wondering, where does 2% GDP defense spending and Arctic security development stand in Canada's growth crisis, and is it an avenue forward?
Well, it's one of the things that hasn't really been factored into cost analysis, because at this point, none of the parties is really committed to it. They've said we'll work towards it, et cetera. And I'm not so sure that we're going to be allowed that kind of latitude in the future. It is interesting watching the reaction from our NATO partners, many of whom have been guilty of the same in the past. But with the developments in Russia, you know, the Russian-Ukraine war, there's a lot of really scared people with good reason in Europe. And there is a strong move within NATO, leave aside the Donald Trump bluster, there's a strong move for all of the NATO partners to increase their defense spending, not just to 2%, but beyond. 2% is supposed to be the floor, the bare minimum. in the future, and we're nowhere near it. You know, we're at, I think, 1.4%. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but that's, that's another $20 billion a year that is expected of us, and nobody's really factored that into their budget analysis, as they haven't factored a lot of things. I mean, do not take projections of spending or deficit levels from this government with any seriousness whatsoever, because they will always, always, always be revised upwards. They play the same trick every budget and every fall economic statement, is they show a graph showing spending increasing at a very slow rate, 1% per year or 2% per year. Every time, majestically, this flat spending curve, and everyone goes away. At least they did for a few budgets. I think people have finally gotten wise to this. But every time people would go, oh, this is a fiscally conservative government, they've put the clamps on spending, except every 6 months when there was a new financial document released, the whole curve would shift up by 10, 15, $20 billion. So yeah, the curve is flat, but it matters where the curve is. And part of that is because they wouldn't actually factor into their future forecasts spending that they already were thinking about. So defense spending is one that I think is non-optional, non-discretionary. But where are we going to find the funds to pay for it, I think is going to be a real challenge, assuming that we intend to be responsible partners at a time of extreme danger. And if we think this is just about Europe, I think we're kidding ourselves. One of my sort of things I lie awake at night thinking about is, what happens if Russia or China or both of them set up shop in our north? You know, they're not going to invade Toronto, but what if they just kind of decided we're going to test what happens? And it'll be something with plausible deniability. It'll just be, groups of scientists at first. But then the scientists need protection or something, and you start bringing in military people. And, at some point, you've got an installation on our soil. What would we do? I don't think any of us have any idea. The assumption has always been, well, they never would dare because the Americans would jump up and down. Well, I'm not so sure, especially if Trump gets in. If Trump gets in, I think he'll say, can you cut me in on a piece of the action? But, what's being tested in Ukraine, and all of the countries around Ukraine know this, is, NATO's resolve and NATO's cohesion is being tested right now. And so far, I would say being found wanting. And so if we don't think that has immediate repercussions for us in this country, I think we're kidding ourselves. So come back to your point is this is a really severe question. And one of the things, again, I talked about how we can't afford to play games anymore. We have played games with military procurement for decades under parties of both parties, where we don't procure military equipment to get the most military benefit for our fighting men and women at the least cost. We do so as empire building for your bureaucrats and regional development and money for favored industries and favored firms. And it's disgraceful, and the numbers are extraordinary. So we're all jumping up and down, and with good reason, about ArriveCAN, okay, which went from supposedly $80,000 initial estimate to $60 million, and how could this possibly happen? And it is outrageous, and it deserves full investigation. Meanwhile, I'll just quote you the cost of one part of one military procurement program. So take the national shipbuilding strategy, which is only one part of military procurement, and take one element of that, which is the buying 12 new frigates and 3 coastal vessels, 15 ships in all. The initial estimate, I believe, if I'm right, it might have even been lower than this, but the initial estimate that it most often gets quoted is, I believe it was $26 billion. And they were to be delivered by, I think, a couple of years from now. And we're now up to $84 billion in Canada, and they haven't built a single ship yet. So trust me, it'll go up higher than this. So $60 million is 1/1000th just of the cost overrun on that one program. So, and when people look at this, when you factor in the life cycle costs of these ships, so it's not just the acquisition cost of $84 billion, but the cost of maintenance and upgrade, which you have to factor in to be a responsible purchaser, just as when you buy a car, you have to factor in what's the gas mileage, what are the likely repair costs. When you factor all those in, The life cycle cost of just those 15 ships is $300 billion. And as Alan Williams, the former Deputy Minister of Defense, has pointed out, that is more than the entire future budget for all military procurements combined, just for those ships. So where are we going to get the money? If we're going to take seriously our own national defense, this is another really hard question that we've not begun to tackle. And again, it just makes the imperative not only to get to grips with procurement, you know, and I think if I wanted to fudge a little, I would say maybe we can work out some deal where we don't have to get all the way to 2 or 3% of GDP, but we can count procurement reform as effectively an increase in spending. Maybe they'll let us get away with something like that, because it would effectively be increasing the bang for the buck if we got serious about procurement reform. But you know, we certainly need to come to grips with defense spending and procurement, but it really, again, increases the imperative that we got to get faster growth. If we're going to afford any of this stuff, we've got to get the economy off the floor.
So as we conclude our evening, a sincere thanks to you, Andrew, for giving us so much of your time. Your talk has given us a lot to contemplate, says my script, and possibly a lot to worry about. We call to action. But at least for now, on behalf of Trent University and the Department of Economics, I'd like to present you with this gift for your lecture tonight. I'll hold on to that and get to it. Yeah, we have our hall is lined with our illustrious speakers, so we will be adding a copy of that to our hall as well. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on a somewhat suspect night. Hopefully it'll hold tonight for the Harry Kitchen Lecture Series on Public Policy. Upcoming, for those interested, a little plug, don't miss the Shepherd Lecture and the Ryle Lecture happening in March as part of the Community Speaker Series, so check for that on the website. And thanks to everyone, but it's not the end. We're going to move it outside for an informal reception, and you're all invited to come and grill Andrew further on his suggestions as to what we need to do. Thank you very much.
That wasn't in the contract.
That's right, we didn't arrange that.